Robert Hurm served the U.S. Coast Guard for 46 months. He served both in the Asian and European campaigns.
I'm going to ask you some questions about your service in World War II, and if you would like to add any other information that isn't included in the questions, then feel free to do so.
Okay, thank you.
During World War II, what branch of service did you serve in?
I was in the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard in World War II was everywhere. We operated with the Navy, and that's the reason I've got my Navy cap on, because I spent 46 months in the Coast Guard, and when I got out, I joined the Naval Reserve. So I had the same rank in the Navy when I got out as I did in the Coast Guard, so I actually served in two services. And go ahead.
What was your rank?
My rank was Chief Machinist Mate, and that put me in charge of the main engine room aboard our ship, which you'll see the picture. And I was in charge of the watch during battle stations when we were attacking submarines. And that's the highest pay grade of an enlisted man.
Where did you serve?
I served both in the Atlantic and Pacific. We did convoy duty from the East Coast into North Africa and over into Europe. The war was over in Europe on May the 7th, 1945, and we were transferred to the Pacific. So we did some time Pacific, but we never fired a shot in the Pacific because they bombed Nagasaki and the war was over.
Why did you pick the branch of service you joined?
I happened to be in college. Pearl Harbor was bombed December 7, 1941 on a Sunday. And in January of 42, I enrolled at Penn State to continue my engineering education. In March, I got a letter from my draft board and it says, "You're going in the Army. No deferment, nothing." So I didn't want to go in the Army. I preferred to go to sea because I had a brother in the Navy. And so I tried to enlist in the Navy in my hometown, and they were full. They had no more room. So I had to go to Pittsburgh, which is 100 miles from where I live, and the Coast Guard had vacancies. And so I enlisted in the Coast Guard and beat the Army recruitment.
Where did you do your basic training?
I did my basic training in Curtis Bay, Maryland. And after I completed my basic training, they looked at my agenda and they saw I had some college education in engineering. So they made me an instructor, teaching other guys how to run ships. And I stayed in Curtis Bay for roughly a year as an instructor, and I got bored. I didn't figure I was cut out to be an instructor. So I left Curtis Bay and went, and they put me aboard ship where I wanted to be.
Did you see combat?
Combat at sea is attacking submarines. And yes, we attacked many submarines during the course of running convoy duty from the East Coast to North Africa and into Europe. The killer submarines are out there looking to sink ships, and we were escorting 150 merchant ships, 23 days to go over, 23 days to come back. And on every trip, one of the escort vessels around the convoy would pick up a contact of a submarine. And then we would attack with depth charges and what we call K-guns to try to ward them away. And we had no idea how many we might have hit because you didn't get credit for a submarine unless it surfaced. But yes, that was combat. It's in the naval term, dropping depth charges.
Tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences.
The most memorable experiences came when we were one of the few ships in the convoy that had a doctor aboard, and most ships didn't carry a doctor. Didn't have enough doctors, of course, and so we got word by radio that there was a merchant seaman on one of the ships was having an appendicitis attack. So in one of the roughest days we had at sea, we were obligated to put the doctor over on that merchant ship on what we call a breeches buoy. In other words, he sits on a stool, and we put the lines over, and they snug the lines on both ends. And he goes. We pull him across. They pull him across their way, and we pull him back. But he had to go over and perform an appendectomy on this seaman, and the thrill of that was the way we had to do it in extremely rough weather. And we got the dock over and got him back. We dunked him a couple times as it ships would, one would go up and one would go down. And he came back wet a couple times, but he was a good sport and he laughed about it. He did a good job.
Were you ever a prisoner of war?
No.
Were you awarded any medals or citations?
The medals that I received were the typical medals that we got after the war, which I have brought here, and they are basically this happens to be the European theater that I qualified for, European African theater. This is the American theater medal. This is the Pacific theater medal. This is good conduct. This is extenuated sea service. And these, of course, this is the what we call the ruptured duck. And this is my dog tag, which everybody had. And then, of course, I had the two insignias on with the fouled anchors because I did the Coast Guard is one with the shield, and that's the tattoo I have on my arm. And then the U.S. Navy, of course, is the one that I happen to wear here because I had the two caps, but the other didn't have a white cap cover. So this is there are no combat stars on there. We never got credit for sinking a submarine. If we would have, or bringing one in, these would have had some stars on. And this is a World War II Victory Medal that everybody gets.
Did you sustain any serious injuries?
No. Luckily enough, I was fairly safe aboard the ship and had no accidents or no injuries.
How often were you able to communicate with your family?
Well, this wasn't the day of email, Ian. This was the day of longhand letters. And I was married at the time and had a young daughter. And so it took us 23 days to go, usually port to port, depending on the weather. And when we would get on the other side, like in North Africa, we would tie up alongside of a tanker to refuel, get ready to go back, and then the mail would come aboard. Now the mail was flown over from New York Post Office, and I would have maybe 15, 17 letters from my wife when I got there, probably maybe half a dozen from my mother. God love her, she managed to write all the time. And so we would have mail call. That was the first thing the crew wanted when we docked. And the Navy was very good in getting our mail there. So everybody would line up for mail call. You call out your name and you collect your letters. You usually go back in a corner somewhere and set them up in chronological order and then tear them apart and read them. Then coming back over, you'd read them a couple more times. But by the same token, underway, I would write my letters when it wasn't too rough. And I would always manage to get some letters to mail when I got to the other side. And of course, we received mail there, from there, and we sent mail. But we waited, it was a 23-day wait between letters. And my wife was always faithful and keeping me advised on the progress of our baby daughter. And my mother would keep me apprised on where my brother was because he was in the Navy, also in the Pacific. But it wasn't the day of the email. That was the wagon train way of doing things.
How did you feel when you got letters from home?
Well, sometimes I cried. I missed the people at home. sometimes the news wasn't good. Maybe a friend had passed away, or, and during the time of the war, my mother would clip a piece out of the paper that said that one of my high school buddies was killed in North Africa, for example, or someone was missing in the Pacific. So some of the letters were really edged in black, and we had to bite our lips once in a while. We was reading them because my mother would divulge to me, usually, and my wife, about the loss of a friend. And of course, it was always good to get the good news about the baby progressing, and my wife, who was living with her mother, was well taken care of. So some news was heartening, and others was disheartening.
What was the food like?
The food aboard ship was fantastic. The Navy has cooking schools, and the cooks aboard ship with the cook rank, they go to these cooking schools. They learned to cook and they learned to bake. They baked our own bread. We didn't go down to the corner grocery or to Walmart or Kmart or Kroger's and buy the sliced bread. He baked it every day in the galley. And when I would get off watch, sometimes they had the 12 to 4, the 4 to 8, and the 8 to 12 watch breakups. When I would get off watch on the 12 to 4 watch, I would go by the bakery. And the cook, the baker in there at that time was a kid from Texas, and he would have lying out on the counter fresh loaves of bread that just came out of the oven. And so I would snitch one of those loaves of bread from him. He basically gave it to me, and get about 1/4 pound of butter. Then I'd go back down the engine room with my buddies, and we'd tear it apart and put the butter on it and eat the fresh baked bread. But food aboard ship was very good, except that there were times when we couldn't eat. The sea was so rough, you couldn't hold a tray on the table, and you tried to stand and eat. We would put wet towels on the table with the tray to keep the trays from sliding. But when you're rolling and pitching and coming up and slamming down, it's almost impossible to hold your food. I always managed to eat something because I was never bothered with motion sickness. But there were kids on there that were, and I'm talking about kids because they were 18, 19 years old, that couldn't touch a bite when we were in the rough sea. But the food was there, and they would serve it every day, whether it was rough or not. They had special devices to hold the pots and stuff, pans on the grill, on the stove, and they always managed to put out the food. We always had coffee. Up in my chief petty officer's quarters, we had continually had a coffee pot on all the time. But the food was, we were lucky. So, Army people were eating out of the mud and didn't know what they were eating, K-ration and stuff like this. We always had a warm meal. Sometimes couldn't get to it to eat it, but eventually it would calm down enough that you could go ahead and get a meal in.
Would you tell me about any particularly humorous event that happened to you or someone that you know?
I can tell you an event that wasn't exactly humorous, but it comes to my mind that we had to go through the Panama Canal, going to the Pacific, naturally. And one of the young boys, one of the young crew members, one of the young seamen, went ashore and got too much to drink. And of course, when you come back aboard ship, when you walk across the gangway, you salute the ensign first. You look back to the stern, you salute the flag. And then you go to the officer of the deck and you salute again and you ask for permission to come aboard if you've been ashore. Well, this kid by the name of Dodge had been ashore, and he was a little staggering a little bit. And when he came ashore, the officer of the deck admonished him for not saluting when he came aboard. The kid got huffy, and he had one of these maracas with a handle on it. They're dried gourds. He broke it, and he said, "Dang you, Mr. Albright," he said, "you get away from me and stop hounding me. I'm going to my bunk." Well, that was enough right there to get him written up in the logbook for misdemeanor misconduct. So they were going to put him in court-martial him, and he could have wound up in the brig. We were supposed to have a court session between Panama and Honolulu. So he came to my quarters one day crying, and he said, "Bob, Chief," he said, "I'm in big trouble, and I need some help." I said, "What can I do?" He said, "Well," I said, "you can defend me." He said, "You have a part of a college education. I think you can read, and we have naval law books aboard." So I got a naval law book, and I read up on how we might appeal, and intoxication could have been an excuse, but our captain was going forward, getting ready to prosecute him when we got to Honolulu. And finally, I think when the attorney or the lawyer aboard our ship, who was one of the officers, he was a lawyer in real life, he found out that I was going to take his case and try to make an appeal for him. They dropped it. So Seaman Dodge was never prosecuted, and I felt good that I really think that whenever they found out that I was going to his defense, that make a case out of it, they dropped it.
What did you think of your fellow officers or soldiers?
Fellow officers, we had a fine complement of officers. Our commanding officer was a lieutenant commander to come out of Coast Guard Academy, and he knew how to handle a ship. His name was Commander Miller, and he was great. He was fairly young. I was 21. Captain Miller was about 26. So he wasn't very old. The lieutenant commander was the Admiral Trowbridge, and he was a long-time sailboat sailor. Somebody came from money, and he had his own sailboat. But see, we had no GPS systems at that time. There wasn't such an animal. So the executive officer, who was Lieutenant Commander Trowbridge, and the chief quartermaster would go out every day and shoot the stars with a sextant, then go in with the mathematical tables and figure out where we were and our exact location. But comparing the Captain Miller and the executive officer, second in command, Trowbridge was, I think, in the long run, a little better sailor overall than our captain, because he had a lot of long time experience, and he was an older gentleman than the captain. The junior officers, the ensigns and the lieutenant JGs, they were super, but they were reservists or enlistees like me. The only academy man on there was the skipper. He spent 4 years in the Coast Guard Academy, and he knew how to handle a ship. But our officers were very competent.
Did you keep a personal journal or diary?
No, I wish I had. And my daughter and my nieces and nephews have asked me if I kept any of my letters, and unfortunately, I look back and I didn't. But I do intend to sit down and do some writing and fill in some of these things, because there are a lot of experiences that I've had during these 46 months in the service that are real interesting, and I think they'd be nice to be documented. Some hot day in the summer, I'll get my word processor maybe and start. I got to get started. Once I get it started, I think I'll go on.
What do you recall about the day the war ended?
2 days the war ended. One day the war ended in Europe, and the other day it ended in the Pacific. And we were on our way back from Mers el-Kabir in North Africa with a convoy, halfway across the Atlantic, coming back. When we left Europe with that convoy, we had received word that the Germans were about ready to surrender. I believe that was May the 5th, 1945. And we got word from the captain on that day. They had received a telegram or a radio message from Washington that the Germans had in fact capitulated, and that we were supposed to watch out on our way back because they were going to, submarines were told to surrender from Germany, from Hamburg, and fly a black flag. And so before we came back, I was trained as part of a submarine boarding party to in case we captured a German sub. My job had been to run the diesel engines, and which I was trained to do by the French on our last trip back. So we received word from Washington that the war was over. We could now run with our lights on at night because we always ran in the dark, everybody, and to keep our eyes open for submarines flying the black flag. Well, our convoy didn't catch any, but the convoy ahead of us off of Bermuda did actually capture a German sub. Now, I have at home a copy of the wireless that we received from Washington telling us that the Germans had surrendered. I received I kept a copy of that telex, or radiogram, as it came from Washington. And then that was the European War. And then we went through the canal, went out to Pearl Harbor, and the ship went as far as Majuro and the Marshall Islands. And by the time we got into Pearl Harbor, they dropped a bomb on Nagasaki, and that war was over. So now I am really happy because I can go home. And they had a point system where, based upon how many months you served, how much active duty you had, like in combat zones and so forth, you accumulate so many points. And so I think 35 points, something like that, was all I needed to get off the ship. And if I requested to get off the ship when I had enough points, they had to let me go. When the war was over, they couldn't hold me. So I think I had something like 41, and I went to the captain when the war was over, and I said, Captain Miller, I said, I want to go home. He said, I'd like you to stay on a little longer because he said, we got some islands in the Pacific that Japs haven't surrendered, and we're probably going to have to shell those islands. We're going to have some active duty. I said, you can go with less of a crew than me. I said, I have been in this man's army 46 months. I have a wife and a baby at home. I want to go back to school and finish my engineering degree. And I said, I feel for the ship and I hate to leave it, but I said, I'm asking permission for you to get me off this ship. So I got off, and I stayed in Pearl Harbor 6 weeks waiting for a ship to take, our ship went on out in the Marshall Islands. I said goodbye to the guys, and I went ashore with my sea bag. Well, they put me up in Barbers Point Marine Base for 6 weeks. The problem being that every ship coming back from Pacific at that time was loaded with personnel. There were Army people coming back, there were Navy people, there were Marines coming back, and any ship that had 2 square feet of space on it was bringing a survivor from that war back home. And Honolulu was at the end of the line. And by the time every ship come through there was no space. So I would watch the bulletin board every day, see if my name would come up. But I stayed at Barbers Point Marine Base for 6 weeks until finally an LST come through, a landing ship tank, that had some room on the tank deck. And they set up a cot for me in that tank deck among sailors, Marines, Coast Guard pilots, all on that tank deck. And we left Honolulu and went and got off the ship in San Francisco. So that was the end of the 2 wars for me.
Could you tell me a little bit about this?
Well, this is my honorable discharge. This is the roadmap and the thing that you're proud of. If you're bad or something in the service, you don't get an honorable discharge. One of the worst things you can do is get a dishonorable discharge. So this thing, in terms of getting a job, in terms of using it as a reference, that's more or less of a Bible and a real staunch crutch. Like I say, this came from the Coast Guard. I have another one in a smaller car that came from Naval Reserve. And Ian,
Yes.
this is my home. My quarters, were right up here in the bow. And so, when this ship would come out of the water and slam down, which it did many times in the rough sea, we were in the roughest place on that ship. We were right behind the chain locker. There's the anchor. And this is the 3-inch gun. These are 40 millimeter aircraft guns, 20 millimeter. And then back here are all the depth charge racks back here. We called those ash cans because they look like ash cans. And they were all loaded with 500 pounds of dynamite. And they were set with a fuse to go off at a certain depth. And so when we would ping on a submarine, we'd know how deep he is. If he's landed 250, 275 feet, they have an adjustment depth switch on these things. And the gunner's mates would set those. They'd receive orders from the bridge to set depth charges at 75 feet. And then sometimes they'd put a whole pattern off. They'd set some at 50, 75, 100, 150 down, and each thing would roll off the end of it, just roll off the end of the ship. And at that time, I'd be in the engine room, and we'd feel those charges gone off underneath us. The ship was gone full speed, 21 knots, 22 knots, and they'd say, release depth charges. Roll the depth charges off the end of the ship. And then we would make an attack, and then there would be a DE or a destroyer behind us come back and duplicate that attack. We'd really lay it to that guy down there once we got a ping and got a contact on a submarine. So this ship was decommissioned and sold to the Mexican Navy after the war. And then I understand, see, that's been a long time ago. I understand it's since been turned into scrap, which happens to a lot of these. But that was my ship for a long period of time. We had a little fewer than 300 people aboard. It was 315 foot long and 40 foot wide, had a 40-foot beam, which is fairly wide. But that's a great memory.
That's all it's going.
Thank you for coming and sharing your story.
Ian, it's my pleasure. I feel so sadly today about the way things are going on. For example, the estimation is that we are losing about 1,000 World War II veterans every day. And I happen to be one of the fortunate ones. I'm 88 years old. I'll be 89 in November. I was 21 when I was in the service. I was 25 when I got out. There's a lot of guys that were in the service that were much younger than I was. But I still have my original dress blue uniform, and I can still wear it. I can still get into my beautiful dress blues because they were made out of real good blue serge cloth. And of course I wear it with a white shirt and a dark tie. Sometimes I do it on Memorial Day or on the Labor Day down at the courthouse. But I kept it in good shape in a zip bag, and of course this is my cap, and I'm very proud of what I've done.
We appreciate your time today.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And
Well,
thank you.
I went pretty long, Ian.
It went exactly.